Okay, so in this video, I'm going to talk about my future self. First off, so the concept of future self is basically a way of thinking about goals and the future. I guess another term for it is or it's the practice of prospection. But basically, right, inevitably we change as people over time, and we tend to see that retrospectively. We can see how different we are, but then underestimate how different we're going to be in the future. And so the idea of the future self is to try to be intentionally shaping who you become in the future. And also, it's a way of thinking about your goal setting in a way that puts it into a clear hierarchy of like what's most important, and a way to set out like, okay, so this is how my future self's going to be, and then everything else like can flow backward from that. And it's also like, I think, really helpful for like putting distance between the two, like when you're making decisions in the moment. And you can ask yourself like, what would my future self do in this situation, rather than just what your like present self is having an impulse to do. Um, and so it's a concept I came across from the work of a psychologist, Benjamin Hardy, um, and it's been really useful to me. And the one less important part is to really think of your future self as a separate person, um, who's different than you. And I think it lends itself to like visualization and stuff like that as well. So that little explanation. So my future self, and a little disclaimer here. My future self is like my current conception of my future self is obviously limited by my own ignorance. Um, and particularly because my future self is very much a political vision. Um, I have a lot more to learn about that, so I'm sure there's some aspects of it that certainly, like, a lot of it will change or become more precise, but and some of it may be wrong in big ways, but I hope that the description I have now like captures kind of the essence of what I want to pursue. So, and then also like it's framed in terms of like relating to me as my future self, like as a person. Um, so, in a sentence, my future self lives freely in a liberated world. Um, so, I'm just gonna read this off because I don't want to miss anything. But basically, the world my future self lives in is free from oppression and exploitation of all forms, including but not limited to class, race, gender, age, disability, and religion. There's no systemic violence and minimal and ever decreasing interpersonal violence. That when interpersonal harm occurs, it's responded to collectively with the aim of healing and transforming the harm done and preventing um, um, future harm, basically like an abolitionist vision of that, of accountability and safety. Um, Everyone is provided and guaranteed the basic necessities of life: food, housing, healthcare, education, an environment, a healthy environment in all senses of the word, that supports people to flourish. Um, and then, one really vivid way I've been thinking about it is wherever there's humanity in the world, there will be no question of or fear of living without any of these necessities, or fear of other people. People can move freely and efficiently from place to place, and like one of the specific ways I've been visualizing this is that my future self could walk down any street at any time of day, anywhere where people live, and be confident that rather than needing to be afraid of the people around me or wary of them or them of me, that we're part of a community and that they're going to look out for me and I'm going to look out for them. Where power is distributed in equal manner and people and communities have control over their decisions and situations in proportion to who is affected by those decisions, basically like self-determination. Communities have control of and exercise stewardship of their ancestral lands. And then this is maybe a little more vague, but every person is supported and encouraged to pursue their passions and continue development in all areas of their life. And then finally, that humanity has transcended anthropocentrism or moved beyond it. Maybe transcended is a little bit of a linear way of thinking about it, and recognizes the fundamental interconnection of all life and worthiness and value of that life, and attempts to live individually and on a societal level in a way that minimizes the suffering and harm to all life. And then finally, that kind of all the current structural crises or like material crises that we're facing, besides like or like related to, but whatever, like climate change, pandemic, disease, and like scarcity of resources like famines and other environmental disasters, all that stuff have been solved. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about how I came to this vision. So I feel like as I moved through like late adolescence and then into young adulthood, one of the fundamental ways I would describe like the journey I've been on has been seeing with increasing vividness this like sharp contradiction between everything that's wrong with the world: oppression, violence, exploitation, suffering, and versus my conviction about how the world should be and could be. And as I become more exposed to the depth of, and more connected to the depth of how effed up everything is, it's become harder and harder to live with, and become a more and more central focus of my life. And it's caused me like a lot of personal emotional distress. I've struggled with depression a lot in my life, and more recently realized or was diagnosed as bipolar. And like, I don't know, there's lots of angles to mental illness, but I've felt that like a really significant cause of it for me has been that trying to live with that contradiction that is just like so intolerable between like the way the world is and should be, but then also like specifically then how am I interacting with that, and like am I contributing to one or the other, and so like I typify the ways like that I've reacted to that in like a couple ways, attempts to like manage that contradiction. And one is that has been pretty steadily decreasing for me is justification, and that's a lot of that is like the world I was living in, or the my perspective on the world that I like grew up with more. Um, and that's like that all in one way or another, these things that in reality are like horrible injustice and oppression and suffering are actually good, or at least tolerable one way or another, necessary, or that they're the people who they happen to somehow deserve it or it's their fault. Um, and then, so that's something I feel like I've been moving steadily away from, is part of that like process of awakening to the actual state of the world. But then the other is to, at kind of the other pole of dealing with it, is just being distracted from it. Um, and that's become a big part of my life. And it was before, but it was just more distracting from my own personal problems and mental illness, whereas now it's that, but it's also deeply tangled up in like this view of the world and needing some sort of escape from it, and instead of focusing and just sitting with and being present with like both like the beauty but also like the horror in the world, just like drowning myself in media, be that like TV and movies, or like the internet in so many different forms. And then on the other side of that, just like intentionally being ignorant. So both like directing my attention towards these distractions, but also intentionally avoiding like learning more about things that I have a intuition or outright knowledge would be like painful to engage with, or deeply challenging to engage with in more depth. Sort of like a designed ignorance. And what's like become clear to me, as this has gone on and the contradictions become increasingly sharp, is that I can't, like, one, to me those both approaches are just immoral fundamentally, but also like I guess morality is manifested through my own conscience. Like I can't live with either of those. It doesn't work for me. And they're at this point repulsive, which doesn't mean I don't fall into them. But it's like on one hand, I'm either like aware of the world without engaging it, but like seeing it as it really is, and it's intolerable as it really is. And then the other end is doing something to either like convince myself it's tolerable or to not actually have to sit with it. And those at times when I felt pessimistic have felt like the only choices really. Because the other possibility, and what I've come to feel is the only possibility, in terms like the only way of living that I can really live with, is to seek to transform the world into a place, to truly like resolve the contradiction rather than trying to navigate or finesse or around it. And so struggling with that has been a big part of the last few years for me. And what I found is that like, right, this burgeoning awareness is not enough because it's so like all these forces are so strong, and the desire, like this instinctual desire to like run away from it, which has been for the most part my path, is to try through various methods of escapism, has been like very very brief periods of trying to engage in the world in like a positive way, then ended with like sudden and pretty complete withdrawals from that into like complete escapism and design ignorance, because I just like, for one reason or another, like couldn't cope with the reality. I think a mix of just like the reality itself and then trying to work on those problems also brings in like a whole host of other things I struggle with, in terms of like personal effectiveness, anxiety, procrastination. Um, and so I've been left, trying to figure out what to do about that. Um, and in those periods where I feel really hopeless, have felt really hopeless, it's like, oh, maybe I just have to find some way to live with this. But I've been lucky enough to, particularly recently in the past year, be exposed to a lot of stuff that has made me believe that it is possible to transform the world. And so in that vein, I guess I want to leave off on a couple things. First, so I grew up around people in 12-step programs, and that's on my mind a lot, particularly the Serenity Prayer. I've thought of a lot over the years, which goes, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And at times, I've really gotten into this and feel like, wow, that's really wise. And then at other times, I felt like it really can be interpreted to promote complacency. And the way I've squared it now is that you need to think about it in terms of time. You know, what we can't change is the past or the present, and so we just need to accept them. But what we can change is the future, and thinking in those broad terms. But also, I've kind of created an inversion for myself that I like better, which is grant me the serenity to accept what I can and the courage to change the things that I cannot accept. And so that goes along with this, because it's not, any other way of living is unacceptable, for me, and feels like it is the destruction one way or another of my soul, whether it's just having to turn myself into a sort of a living dead person, by just being drowned in consumption and distraction and addiction, or through actively kind of convincing myself that what I know fundamentally is wrong is right. Either way is a different path to just to be maybe melodramatic, but I really believe this, the annihilation of my soul. And so that sort of is a vague, rambling way of describing how I then came to my future self, which is like, what is the world that I could live in?